Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Forum Space. Thanks for joining us for today's event, Black Studies at Concordia. And this is the third session in a speaker series for the Concordia's minor in Black and African Diaspora Studies in the Canadian context. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. And we respect the continued connections with the past, the present and the future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And here at Forum Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge, co-creating daily activities, conversations, examining research questions happening across the university. Now, we're running today's event as a live stream both to YouTube as well as a Zoom meeting. So if you're joining us there, comments and questions, please just add those into the chat. We'll do our best to read those out a little bit later. And those of you here in the space, you may know, just raise your hand. We'll run a microphone around to you so that everyone can hear. Okay, with that, it's very much my pleasure to pass the microphone over to our special advisor in Black Integration and Knowledges, as well as our Concordia University Research Chair in Ecologies of Black Performance and Associate Professor in Contemporary Dance, Angelique Wilkie. It's great to have you.
Thanks, Doug. Hi, all. It's a lot of titles. I don't usually hear them all in one go. Just to contextualize the moment, so this is session number 3, as Doug mentioned, and I'm happy to say this is, a year into the launch of the Black Studies minor. Black Studies certificate has now been launched as well. It was approved in Senate just before Christmas. So starting this fall, there'll be a Black and African Diaspora Studies in the Canadian context certificate. For those who are not yet at Concordia, that's, a great way to enter. And for what it's worth, there is already conversation around grad level microprogram. So, slow but sure. I think the only other thing that I would want to say is an enormous thank you to you all and to my trusty elf, Badawa, without whom none of this would be possible. So I want to thank you. Don't stare out the door, that's you. In terms of other events going on around Black History Month, through the Research Chair in Ecologies of Black Performance, I'm in partnership with Cinema Politica to be programming True North, which is the film by Michelle Stevenson on the 1969 Sir George protests. And that'll be happening next week, Monday night in the Hall building. It's an extraordinary piece of work, and it's a story that we need to keep telling. On that note, thank you all. Have a great time.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Fernanda. I will be the moderator today in this speaker series. I am a researcher and creator from Brazil. I am here doing my PhD in film studies at Concordia University. My research is on Black female experimental animation within an intersectional context and thinking through the animations as counter histories and counter narratives. Before we begin, I would like to read a land acknowledgement as well. That was written by Dr. Dolores V. Mullins within the context of the inaugural Interinstitutional Forum of the Scarborough Charter on Anti-Black Racism and Black Inclusion in Canadian Higher Education in May 2022 in Vancouver, Canada. We call upon our ancestors, remembering all who came before us. We honor you, our African ancestors who paved the way for us in the diaspora and in the motherland, cradle of civilization, Mother Africa. Your bodies, blood, flesh and bones, then and now, nourish the earth and color great and small, fresh and salted waters. African, Caribbean, and Black people, no matter where in the world we are, share a common bond of courage, determination, indomitable spirit, and greatness. and we acknowledge our differences and similarities embedded in the bloodlines of kings and queens, inventors, warriors, and philosophers. Some of you endured the brutality of transatlantic enslavement, forced to give free labor, built nation-states worldwide in barebacks, and still managed to be victorious in achievements. We honor you today and call upon your wounded and triumphant spirits to share this space and bask in our glory of you, all our foremothers, fathers, parents, and relations. We know that you fought alongside Indigenous peoples yesteryear for freedom, so we know that our liberation is tied to the liberation of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and the world. We cannot ever be liberated if our Indigenous relations remain in bondage under the tyranny of historical and modern colonialism. We will not let your toil and service to humanity and to Black peoples go in vain. So we carry on in your footsteps, reaching for higher heights, creating memories and deeper prints for those of us here now, and babes unfertilized yet to come. All right, so I will begin by introducing our speakers today. Dr. Joana Joachim is Assistant Professor of Black Studies in Art History and Social Justice at Concordia University. Her research and teaching interests include Black feminist art histories, Black diasporic art histories, critical museologies, Black Canadian studies, and Canadian slavery studies. Her SSHRC-funded doctoral work, There Then, Here Now, examined the visual culture of self-preservation and self-care through Black women's historical and contemporary creative acts. She earned her PhD in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies and at the Institute for Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies at McGill University, working under the supervision of Dr. Charmaine A. Nelson. Dr. Joachim obtained her master's degree in museology from Université de Montréal and her BFA cum laude from University of Ottawa. In 2025, she was appointed as Deputy Director of the Gail and Stephen A. Jarislowsky Institute for Studies in Canadian Art at Concordia University. Dr. Joachim's scholarship has appeared in books, journals, and magazines, including History, Art, and Blackness in Canada, Manuel Mathieu, World Discovered, Under Other Skies, RACAR, Canadian Journal of History, and C Magazine. Thank you, Dr. Joachim, for being here today. Dr. Marcelo Shiramo is a faculty member in the Department of Psychology at Concordia University with over a decade of professional experience in diverse mental health settings. She has taught for the past 4 years with a focus on courses in cultural psychology. Her scholarly work and research interests are grounded in cultural psychology. The study she will be presenting examines the acculturation experiences of adolescents of African descent in American high schools. This research centers on the perspectives of African youth while situating their lived experiences within the broader psychological literature on acculturation. Thank you, Dr. Shiramo. Can we begin with Dr. Joachim?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I want to thank everyone at Fourth Space also for keeping us all organized. And I'm grateful also to you and you for being here and sharing this space with me. I'm excited to contribute to this wonderful series. I think that there's a lot going on at Concordia, and it feels like an exciting moment to be part of. I also want to mention briefly that There's one archival image in my slideshow that you may find a little bit disturbing. There's nothing graphic in the image. However, it does depict blackface minstrelsy. I move on from this image within about a minute, and so you can do with that information whatever you think is necessary. The other thing that I would like to do before I launch into this talk is to touch on the why of this particular research inquiry of mine. Obviously, to the surprise of absolutely no one on this chaotic, hurtling stone that is the earth that we call our home, I love art. And one of the periods that I find particularly interesting is the early 20th century, which specifically the interwar period here in Montreal and elsewhere, partly because this time frame coincides with the Harlem Renaissance, and also the fashion, of course. This is going to be interesting. This was a little image about liberation, because this is what I think about when I think about the interconnectedness of Indigenous and Black liberations. And so I wanted to have an image to sort of signify that I believe these things fundamentally. So, the Harlem Renaissance was a movement that occurred during the 1920s, 1930s, and was marked by an intellectual and cultural revival. At the time, it was called the New Negro Movement. And it was an effervescent period which was marked by a proliferation of music, literature, and visual art emerging from Black gatherings in Harlem, New York, and across several parts of the United States. If you're not familiar with the history of Montreal, you may be wondering why these things are connected in my mind, Montreal and the Harlem Renaissance. Well, in the 20s and 30s, this was also a time during which prohibition was in effect in the United States, but this was not the case here in Canada. And so many Americans would come up north for access to recreational drinking, entertainment, because the jazz scene in Montreal was booming. In fact, Montreal came to be known as the Harlem of the North. This begs the question: if Black Americans, musicians, writers, and artists alike, were coming to Montreal during this time period to rub shoulders with our local Black community, who were their Black Canadian peers? Who were the Black Canadian musicians, writers, and artists of this Harlem of the North? Of course, we know the musicians included people like the great Oscar Peterson and his older sister, Daisy Peterson Sweeney, who taught him how to play piano, as well as Eleanor Collins, Oliver Jones, and of course, Rufus Rughead, to name a few great Black Canadian musical figures from this time period. In terms of literature, we start to hit a bit of a snag. We know rather less about Black Canadian writers from this period, and the little bits that I've been able to pull together through my cursory research came through a little article written by George Eliot Clark, where he names the publication Clarence and Corinne, or God's Way, which was published in 1890 by Amelia Etta Hall Johnson, and the Album of a Heart, a collection of poetry by R. Nathaniel Dett, which was published in 1911. Coincidingly, Dett would eventually become a jazz composer during the 1930s. And then lastly, Clark mentions Anna Minerva Henderson, who also published poetry in the 30s, and then later would publish Citadel, a collection of poetry in 1967. Now, I'm obviously convinced that there are far many other writers to be found, but alas, I'm not a literary scholar. And so, this brings us to my area. It brings us to visual art, and the situation is all the more bleak. You see, the fact is that we know next to nothing about Black Canadian visual artists during this period. We know very, very little about Black Canadian artists before the 1960s overall, and that has always bothered me. It makes no sense to me that in a place like Montreal, positively buzzing with homegrown talent, during this time, there would be no visual artists anywhere at all. Whereas in a place like Harlem, At the very same time, there's an abundance of visual artists, including notable figures like Augusta Savage, Aaron Douglas, Laura Wheeler Waring, Jacob Lawrence, and Richmond Barthé, just to scratch the surface. So then the question becomes, if indeed Montreal was the Harlem of the North, why is it we know so little about Black visual culture here beyond music during this period? So the next slide is the one I mentioned that might be a little upsetting to some. Of course, one obvious factor is the racist stereotype that casts Black folks as inherently rhythmic and musically talented, which we are. And this is directly related to the history of minstrel shows, which became a popular form of theater during the 19th century, soon after the abolition of slavery. I imagine most of you know this, but in a nutshell, minstrel shows featured white actors in blackface, portraying us in stereotypical and disparaging ways, some of the most common being that we are ignorant, lazy, buffoonish, superstitious, always joyous, and of course, musical. Indeed, there's a long history of these types of performances in the Canadian theater, particularly in Québécois theater. And this makes me wonder if the lack of scholarly engagement with Black Canadian literature and visual art in some ways continues to reinforce these harmful stereotypes through the emphasis on music as the most foregrounded cultural contribution that Black folks have made in Canada. Now, that, my friends, is a rabbit hole for another day. Instead, for a session together today, I will be presenting a brief excerpt from an article that I've been working on, tinkering with for maybe 2 years now, where I discuss some of the research strategies and methods used to work through the conundrum that is Black art in lesser known periods and areas in Canada. I propose to think through how the combination of Black studies approaches with art historical research can begin to expand how we understand Black visual histories on this land. In other words, I'm asking, how do we apply Black studies to art history? My paper today is entitled Total Inversion, Black Studies in Canadian Art History. Let's jump in. Black people in Canada have a long-standing presence on this land, dating back at least to the early 1600s. Yet a collective understanding of the overarching trajectory of Black Canadian art history specifically remains largely elusive. Black feminists have underscored the importance of contending with the ongoing impacts of interlocking systems of oppression. Similarly, they have argued that the same considerations must be applied to art history. Taking cues from Black studies methodologies to develop a nonlinear cross-temporal approach which pushes at the edges of art history, I examine the stakes of Black Canadian art practices in the context of collective liberation. Developing a distinctly Black Canadian art history must be enmeshed in a strategic reframing of how we engage with and understand Canadian art, history, and archives. I propose to think through art history itself and consider how the combination of Black studies approaches with art historical research can begin to expand how we understand Black visual histories here. Black studies in this context demands a total inversion of materials and methods normally associated with art history, producing a film negative of Canadian art history, allowing us to trace the shapes of Black art historical gaps and infer what might have filled them. With this article, I argue that total inversion subverts the persistent notion that Canada is a better, less violent site for Black life compared to other settler colonial contexts by paving the way towards developing a rigorous discourse around Black Canadian art history beyond the contemporary period. And in art history, the contemporary period refers specifically to 1960s forward. Using Black studies methods to attend to these issues reveals Black Canadian art histories as the resulting image of this total inversion, thus bringing in to focus a clearer picture of lesser known Black visual histories. Put differently, Black studies holds what we know about Black history up against the canon of Canadian art, like an archival total eclipse, allowing us then to read the resulting stellar corona as Black Canadian art history. Some of the few art historical publications dedicated specifically to developing a Black Canadian art historical discourse include Charmaine A. Nelson's Towards an African Canadian Art History, the edited volume Making History, Visual Arts, Blackness in Canada by Julie Crooks, Dominique Fontaine, and Sylvia Forney, as well as the Toronto-based magazine Tiger Lily, co-founded by Ayana Black and Zanana Akande in the 1980s, which focused broadly on women of color artists. Nelson's 2018 edited book, in particular, being the first of its kind, consolidates the field of African Canadian art history, marks a major step forward in tracking Black visual histories from the period of slavery to now. In Canada, Black studies are crucial tools for grappling with the deliberate erasures of Black visual and material culture on this land. The overall limited art historical discourse focused on Black Canadian art is in part due to a lack of preservation of Black archival and material culture on this land. This can be attributed both to histories of forced displacement of established Black communities under the guise of urban renewal during the 1960s, and to Canadian institutions' gross oversight of Black culture over many decades. Some examples of the physical destruction of Black communities and cultural hubs can be found right across Canada, from Africville in Halifax to Saint-Antoine districts or Little Burgundy here in Montreal, straight through to Priceville, Ontario, right across to Hogan's Alley in Vancouver. I should note, too, that countless smaller communities were doubtless also dealt a similar fate, with fewer witnesses to carry forward their memory. Each of these once thriving Black communities were systematically torn apart, and with them, an unknown quantity of art objects, archives, and material culture. These issues are further compounded by the ongoing trend of peaks and valleys of institutional support and neglect towards contemporary Black creative practices. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, in the Canadian art milieu, were marked with an uptick of institutional engagement with communities of color as topics of identity politics, cultural diversity, multiculturalism became a driving force behind many curatorial practices, both here and further abroad. And this period was also coincided with the early iterations of what would eventually become EDIA policies at the Canada Council for the Arts, as artists and activists of color across the country called for increased financial support and representation from art institutions. Advocacy by Black women in particular yielded a veritable boom of Black representation in art museums and galleries for a time. Despite the seeming changing tide, however, what followed was a gradual decline in institutional investment in Black and otherwise culturally diverse artists. This cycle would repeat itself in the early 2000s and begin anew nearly 2 decades later, peaking in 2020. Excuse me. Following the massive protests surrounding several police murders of unnamed Black individuals during the COVID-19 pandemic. In recent years, Black people in Canada and in the art milieu have once again experienced a steep increase in visibility and inclusion in museums and galleries. While each of these peaks present opportunities for Black Canadian artists and curators, the ensuing valleys leave many key actors exhausted, unsupported, and disillusioned. These trends are compounded by the shifting winds of government policy, which are, pardon me, overly reliant on the will of individual actors within art institutions to make and maintain institutional changes and tend to revert to their old ways after activist pressures ease. Since 2024, such projects and initiatives have increasingly been openly attacked and dismantled, marking the beginning of the next valley. Black Canadians have historically produced exhibitions featuring visual and material culture from our communities, which are rarely taken up critically or discussed in depth within the Canadian art milieu. The landmark exhibition, Black Women, When and Where We Enter in 1989, is often touted as a pivotal moment in Black women's art history in Canada, organized by the Diasporic African Women's Art Collective, DAWA for short, and featuring many artists and activists of the period, it stands as a beacon which would herald in a new era of Black curatorial practice. Yet, critical texts discussing this foundational event in Canadian art and its lasting impacts on the milieu are extremely limited. The most thoughtful assessment of this exhibition and its impacts include the oft-cited article by my colleague here at Concordia, Alice Ming Y. Jim, and more recently, Yani Ali's groundbreaking publication, Busechebeli, Reasons Why We Have to Disappear Every Once in a While, which chronicles Busechebeli's career. She was a DAWA founding member and adds a brand new interview to the discourse around her practice. Critical writing about Black art histories and exhibitions in Canada, that is writing which seriously engages with their form, content, and context, are crucial aspects of not only documenting these artists, but also developing a discourse around their practice. Key Black Canadian exhibitions and art practices routinely go ignored by the art historical community, with few reviews or articles or books being penned about them. Despite the consistent contributions of Black women to the field, the historical lack of engagement on the part of art historians and critics with the work of Black women artists and curators in many cases leaves curatorial essays and artist statements for exhibitions as their sole remaining textual records. This has resulted in an unstable and incomplete record of Black Canadian art practices, as well as a shallow art historical discourse about them. The further back in Canadian chronology we reach, the sparser material traces of Black art histories seem to become. With Black studies tracing Black Canadian art histories from abolition to the current moment is neither impossible nor futile. Research methods for tracing these histories must necessarily spill beyond the edges of what's called traditional art history as a consequence of the paucity of records within expected repositories and collections, which have by and large neglected their duties towards Black histories in Canada, especially until very recently. Black Canadian art historians, curators, and critics have for several decades used Black studies methods to painstakingly retrieve and piece together traces of Black creative practices dating all the way back to the late 19th century. While some key figures, like the ones I mentioned previously, have done so through traditional academic research and publication, many others have gone a few steps beyond this. These kaleidoscopic approaches in Black studies are what Catherine McKittrick refers to as method making, or rebellious methodologies. This move away from usual art historical methodologies is what I'm calling total inversion. It implies a fundamental rethinking and reforming of research approaches to get closer to what we might deem a Black Canadian art history. Through the work of folks like David Woods and Adrienne Johnson, who both use extensive archival research, community canvassing, memory work, and oral history, we now know a great deal more about Edith Hester MacDonald Brown, pictured here, who is thought to be the first documented Black female painter in Canadian art history. One of her earliest surviving pieces dates back to 1898, produced at the age of 12. It is believed that she may have attended art school while briefly living in Montreal's Plateau district. Through Woods and Johnson's research, some artworks made by Edith's own daughter have also been uncovered. Ruth Brown Johnson created a series of 5 linoleum block prints depicting landscapes, views of Africville in 1949. Woods' research similarly contextualizes the oeuvre of Edward Mitchell Bannister, also pictured here. He was from St. Andrews in New Brunswick and was a self-taught African-Canadian painter of the Barbizon School, known for pastoral landscapes and seascapes. In 1876, his painting Under the Oaks, which is now lost, unfortunately, won first place at the Centennial Exposition Art Exhibition in Philadelphia, thus making him the first artist of African descent and the first Canadian to win a major art prize in North America. Before becoming a full-time painter, Bannister worked as a cobbler, a shipmate, a barber, and crucially, as a daguerreotypist. I can never say that word. This implies that he was a photographer, perhaps even practicing before his departure to the United States, meaning that his works, should they ever be located, could be read alongside the likes of renowned Canadian photographer, white Canadian photographer, William Notman, who was also active in the late 1800s. So by building relationships over many years and trusting the living knowledge of Black elders and community members, scholars like Woods and Johnson were able to recuperate undervalued Black art histories that identify landscape painting and photography as Black art practices, locating them squarely in the era of the founding of the Royal Canadian Academy of the Arts in the 1880s. Total inversion in this process of archival research, community canvassing, memory work, begins with the understanding that Black visual histories in Canada, by and large, exist within the gaps in common knowledge and within community. Hence, it requires scholarship that is embedded in the living collective knowledge of Black community. Archival inquiries as curatorial practice go hand in hand in tracing photographic histories of Black subjects and makers in Canadian art. Elisa Fearon is another fantastic example. She brought to light William Billy Beale's legacy. He was a sawmill engineer in the early 1900s, as well as an avid photographer. Through this project, Fearon also raised important questions about how we think through and engage with Black visual material in the archive. Her exhibition, Black Prairies, which was held at Dunlop Art Gallery in 2025, presents over 100 years' worth of Black Canadian cultural production in the prairies, spanning from the 1920s to the present. In addition to this exhibition, sorry for the blurry photos, I don't know how pixels work. So in addition to the Black Prairies exhibition, Fearon produced the short documentary For Caesar, written and directed by Cheryl Fogo. The film explores the beginnings of the Shiloh Baptist Church and Cemetery and its significance to the Shiloh people and their descendants, chronicling the period of the Great Migration and the arrival of Black families to Saskatchewan in and around 1910. The documentary tells the tale of Caesar, one of the founding members of the Shiloh people, and his descendants' journey in restoring the church and obtaining its designation as a cultural heritage site. Total inversion in art history subverts the presumption that Black life and art, if located in Canada at all, predominantly exists in urban centers. Rather, it assumes the contrary, insisting on Blackness in all spaces and seeking material traces of it in spite of all indications that this may be a fruitless venture. Documentaries, then, are another crucial avenue for recording and examining information about unknown or overlooked Black artists and makers. Beyond the production of these documents, carefully rereading existing documentaries from a Black Studies art historical standpoint also lends itself to developing a discourse around Black visual histories in Canada, as is the case with Catherine Tolbert, for example. Many of the images associated with the jazz scene in Montreal, and which circulate widely from the archives of the famed Rockhead Paradise and Café Saint-Michel, yet few people know that Tolbert was behind the camera in many cases. She was born and raised in Middleton, Nova Scotia, and in her early 20s, she came to Montreal, and she worked here in home care and as a photographer, taking photos of the clubs, their patrons, and just nightlife in Montreal in both of these sites, so Rockheads and Café Saint-Michel. The NFB documentary, The Road Taken, which covers the history of Black sleeping car porters who worked in Canada's railways from the early 1900s to the 1960s, is one rare source linking Catherine to these images in a short 2-minute clip where she's interviewed about her time in Montreal. Her photographic work from this time is otherwise largely unattributed. Total inversion through rebellious methodologies is what makes possible reconsideration of these archival images and this documentary from an art historical standpoint. This kind of digging is precisely the work that the Black Art Histories Montreal Research Group is also undertaking. Through their work, they have uncovered the practice of the likes of Cyril Adams and Joan Roll, among many other Black makers in Montreal prior to the 1990s. Their research shows that Adams, for his part, was both trained and exhibited in his paintings in Montreal between the 1940s and 60s. The group also narrates the life of and career of Joan Roll, one of the only Black women modernist painters known to have been active in Montreal during the period of the 1950s. In 2024, the group compiled the first edition of an extensive bibliography of primary and secondary sources related to Black artists in Montreal between 1950 and 1995. In their collaborative work, they continue to uncover a veritable mountain of yet untreated and underexamined archival and visual materials pertaining to Black art practices in Montreal before the internet, so before 1990. Through the aggregation of and collation of archival data, it becomes possible to make crucial connections across time and space in Black Canadian art history, and thus begin to map a broader historical context around specific artists, galleries, and exhibitions. A number of projects endeavoring to do this have emerged in recent years. I'm gonna give you one example here. Yanya Lee's Black Art Study is a decentralized, citation-driven database of Black Canadian art scholarship, which is one segment of a 4-part portfolio that she's produced, the book about Busechi Bailey being one part. This Lee's discussion of the project encapsulates much of the intended rebellious methods that I'm outlining here. So I'm gonna quote her for a moment. She notes, quote, "The citational and relational way of organizing and presenting the scholarship on this database was formed in answer to the following question. How do we build a database that honors Black Canadian art history scholarship without reifying a classificatory system that is irreconcilable with Black liberation?" End quote. With this reflection, Lee gestures towards a larger issue. That is, how might we bring together Black Canadian art historical threads to form a broader discourse while resisting the colonial logics that have deemed it illegible or invalid for so long? In posing these questions and responding to them in methodologically rebellious manner, these scholars enact Black studies in art history. They are enacting a total inversion. In this way, the contributions of Black artists in Canada can be tethered to one another, collapsing time and space to form a loose, shifting network of Black makers. Black studies methods allow new meaning to be wrought from seemingly unrelated archival sources as researchers look anew at new materials with the express intent of tracking down Black artists and their work. For example, returning to archival images of the jazz scene in Montreal during the early 20th century, while a cursory glance might reveal another visual record of the musical history of the city, looking at them with a Black art historical gaze leads us to wonder who the photographer might have been, or to notice the murals in the background and to wonder who painted those. Through total inversion, these images and objects become witnesses of anonymized Black makers all across Canada. Canadian art history must also seriously take the fact that Black studies are simultaneously a modality through which to read art by Black makers and are central to the very production of these artworks. That is, Black studies are enmeshed in how Black artists make their work to begin with, and thus is a key to understanding them. Using these methods to flesh out a distinctly Black Canadian art historical discourse therefore reflects the very practices of artists here. Black studies and art history are fundamental pillars in the practices of many Black visual artists in Canada. And so employing Black studies to aid in a total inversion of Canadian art history shapes the very approach art historical research takes and supports rigorous textured discussions about Black visual and material culture. Black studies in Canadian art history demands that we push beyond merely commenting on cultural diversity or representation to instead engage meaningfully with the core of these practices, peeling back their formal and conceptual layers to contextualize their processes and history. A total inversion also subverts the persistent notion that Canada is a better, less violent site for Black life compared to other contexts. It isn't. Black studies in art history are one of the myriad paths towards disabusing many people of this notion. With this lens of total inversion as a guiding principle in infusing Black studies in Canadian art history, it might be possible to push even further, to properly record and engage in rigorous discourse about Black Canadian art. And so next, I'm just going to show you an example of the next layer of this that I'm thinking of in terms of what's possible if we move with this total inversion approach in mind. So using total inversion to examine the work of Beaver Hall group members like Prudence Heward, Beaver Hall group being a very famous white Canadian group of artists operating in the 30s and 40s in Montreal. Prudence Heward and her numerous paintings of Black women and girls in the 1930s and 40s opens a completely new line of inquiry. As Charmaine Nelson and my colleague Julia Skelly have argued, a critical analysis of her works reveals them as a record of how white artists perceived Black people at the time. I'm proposing that with total inversion, it's possible to go beyond this. Using Black studies methods in an analysis of such paintings demands a reading which positions Black life, and thus the sitter, at the center of the narration and contextualization of these pieces. Beyond naming the power dynamics at play between the artist and the sitter on the level of race, class, gender, etc., a total inversion of works such as Heward's Girl in the Window, which you see on screen, offers a glimpse into the life of Black people who might have had an interest in becoming artists in Montreal at the time, but could only access these spaces by working as models or domestic workers for the white artists. Indeed, we know that this time period was an effervescent moment for Black creative practice, not only through music and performing arts, but also through craft and art education. Black women in particular were active in practicing and teaching craft like embroidery and sewing to local youths in Montreal. I would argue that in some cases, this was the most accessible and realistic venue for their creative expression, given the pervasive racist and sexist temperament of the period. Might it be then that in looking more closely at an anonymized portrait like this one could uncover the story of an aspiring Black woman artist, not unlike Joan Roll, whose ambitions were curtailed by her social condition in mid-century Montreal. Are we looking at the likeness of a woman whose love for art and desire to be involved in it in whatever way necessary led her to model or work for Heward? Total inversion asks us to simultaneously seek out fragments of Black art history that have been left untended to for too long, and further to consider what might happen to canonical Canadian art, white Canadian art, if we read it with Black Canadians and our history in mind. Through total inversion, these become surrogate records of Black life and histories and the social conditions which prevented Black makers from being properly recorded in Canadian art history. There's a dire need for deep engaged research and writing on Black artists across larger swaths of time and space in Canadian art history specifically. Regrettably, the last decade in Canada has corroborated Andrea Fatona's assessment that the art milieu's record of support of Black art history is rife with inconsistent engagement and swinging dizzyingly from extreme solicitation to near total disregard at best and retaliation at worst. What does it say about Canadian art histories that Black community members, elders, and youth alike, wishing to learn about and recuperate their visual histories on this land must routinely take matters into their own hands? This type of historical research in the Canadian context is extremely difficult, time-consuming, and often thankless. Yet the fact remains that it needs to be taken on by professionals in the field. Art historians invested in the liberatory potential of their work need a better set of tools to accomplish this gargantuan task. Black studies methods can enact a total inversion of Canadian art history and reject the violence which continues to mar this discipline, allowing new meanings to emerge. Working with this total inversion way makes it possible to press forward with random questions like, who were the visual artists of the Harlem of the North, and hope to find a satisfying answer. And in closing, I just want to mention that I once had the privilege of being on a panel with Dr. Amal Madibo, who works at University of Toronto. And she ended her presentation in a really beautiful way, thanking every person that had been involved in her project, insisting that none of us who work in academia accomplish our work completely alone, and I completely agree. And so in that spirit, a very warm thank you to my students, my RAs, as well as the librarians and archivists who have made my work possible over the years. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Joachim. I should have said earlier, we will hear both professors first, and then at the end we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. So hold on to your questions and doubts and comments until the end. And now, please, Dr. Shiramo.
Good afternoon, everyone. If no one said it to you yet, happy Black History Month. I am grateful that I was invited to speak, particularly this month, because of the topics that we're discussing. What I like to do, I'm not trained in academia. As you heard, I'm from the field of practice, so I liked for people to engage. So we're actually going to engage throughout my presentation. First off, I'd like to introduce myself. I do this in every class because I'm speaking from a perspective, and I understand that, and I know that as you all engage, you have a perspective as well. I am from the US, so I started teaching here 2022. I was teaching in upstate New York prior, and prior to that, I was practicing in the field of mental health. I am from the US. I was born in the US, but my family is from Zimbabwe. I don't know if anyone knows where that is. Yes, one person. Thanks. It's Southeast Africa, and that's where I grew up. That's home for me. And then I moved back to the US for school because I'm not a citizen. Most of the work that I do that's my perspective. I move through life through that, and I'm talking about acculturation because I've done that quite a bit, and I'm actually doing that right now here in Montreal because the cultures are different. So I want to, yes, I'm supposed to do this, okay. So my education background as well is quite interesting. If anyone has African parents tend to tell you what you're going to do, right? And for me, it was either be a lawyer or something else. And then I stumbled on psychology, which I found very fascinating because it looks at the mind and behavior. Like, why do we do what we do? And what I found in my undergraduate studies is that there was no mention of culture. And because of my personal experience, some of the things that were discussed in my classes just didn't match, right? So when I was looking for my graduate school, I wanted to study psychology and culture. Now I'm glad that there are programs out there. Back then, they weren't. So because I enjoy working with youth, I found a program that combined culture and working with youth. And then I found another program that is related to psychology and international perspective on psychology. Through my graduate studies as well, I was able to do 3 international internships. The first one was in Johannesburg, the second one was in Brazil, and the third was also in China. And the topic of acculturation continued to stick. And that's something that I wanted to study because I had personally experienced that. Now, in research, sometimes you're told to keep yourself out of it. But in this case, I couldn't because that's what was informing what I was interested in. So through my education, I also worked I really wanted to do international development. I stumbled on mental health practice, which is what I did for a while in different settings. Again, that question about where is culture in all of this, right? We have theories, we have practice, we have research that is centered on specific groups, right? And for me, I wanted to really understand, what about my culture, right? Where do we fit in research and practice? So that's where I am right now. I'm here at Concordia. But I also wanted to include, this is where we're going to do some kind of interaction here. I wanted to include a philosophy that is not Western, right? Because psychology, the history of psychology is philosophy, right? And we oftentimes hear about Greek philosophy, yet there are other philosophies that actually influence psychology. You may have heard of Ubuntu. It comes from this philosophy, Umuntu, Gumuntu, Ngabuntu, right? Meaning that I am because you are, right? And I want us to practice that. So with the person next to you, maybe introduce yourself. This is the idea that we are interconnected. The reason that I know myself is because you are who you are, right? And that's the essence of what we do in psychology. So for a few minutes, please introduce yourself to the person next to you and maybe practice saying Umuntu, Gumuntu, Ngabuntu. So we'll do that for a few minutes.
Okay. Hello, I'm Fernanda. I'm from Brazil. I grew up in Brazil and we came to Montreal in 2022. Me and my husband and my daughter. And it's been a process of finding the ground again within our feet. I think in Brazil there's this fallacy of equality in terms of race that makes it very difficult to find yourself within a Black context necessarily. So that has been a process for me as well. And I don't know, I think in terms of acculturation, I'm always anxious and concerned about my daughter.
Okay, we can come back. I hope you met someone.
So that's
and I think it's informative. When I think of this, growing up, it makes sense that the reason I know of who I am is because you are who you are, and it also leaves space for people to be that. And I think that in psychology, like I said, what we're looking at is a scientific study of the mind and behavior. So we're looking at emotions and the way people think. And in the study that I did, studying acculturation, this kind of was evident in the whole process, actually, from finding participants to conducting interviews to doing the analysis and the discussion as well. So I'm hoping that you'll see that throughout the conversation today. So what is culture? Culture tends to be something that's just out there, right? I think we have different definitions of it. In cultural psychology, there are these two sort of terms that we use. This is a shared context. And Stephen Hine is the one who came up with this, and he is Canadian. He's a white Canadian. And I think it actually gives a sense of, it grounds it, right? So the idea of a shared context. These are values, beliefs of a group of people that a group of people share. So if you're not within that shared context, you may not understand that group, right? So you may have seen people do different practices, and you've wondered that that's kind of odd that they do that, right? And it makes sense because you're not part of that shared context. And the way that we learn it is through social learning. So there are reinforcements, there is punishment, that we then internalize these values, right? That's why, for me, right, I'm here in Montreal, but I still carry my Zimbabwean culture. I didn't leave it in Zimbabwe, right, because I internalize it. So I wanted us to have this definition as we continue to have this conversation about the topic. So why acculturation? Again, acculturation is a term that may not mean the same thing. If you asked each other, what's your definition of acculturation, you might have different theories, right, about it. And for me, I was interested in acculturation because of the experiences that I've had, right, where I've noticed that I'm actually creating my own culture, right, based on the experiences that I've had. Zimbabwean culture, American culture, Montreal culture, they're all influencing how I actually go by the world, right? And we also want an increase in understanding, right? I want to understand why is it that sometimes, if you look at intergenerations, right, why sometimes maybe grandparents behave a different way than like great-great-grandchildren, right? With culture, sometimes we might fear that culture is not being preserved, right? But if we're moving, we tend to see that, that different cultures are actually influencing us. And we need to learn how to navigate that. So we want increased understanding. An example of this is that I used to work in a school that had a lot of African students. And they asked me to come in to do a mental health exam on all of them. And what I found was that there was nothing that was related to mental health. It was all these cultural misunderstandings that were happening, right? And if we don't have that information, right, we wouldn't understand how do I then support students? What needs do we need for them so that they're able to actually engage in the school, right? So increase in understanding. And as we know, there's always lack of research on Black population. Now, if you look at research, particularly in psychology, you often see where it says just Black culture. Now, we know that there is diversity within Black culture, right? I know that within Zimbabwean culture, there's diversity as well, right? And we're missing so much information, so much understanding when we tend to also group people as Black population, right? So there's a lack of research on that, and we hear quite a bit in psychological databases that we have weird population, right? And the idea of conducting research with participants from different cultural backgrounds informs, right, the practices, it informs theories, so that we're able to actually conduct practice in a way that's actually beneficial. So my research was on the acculturation experiences of East African adolescents in US high schools. Now, this was interesting. This was based on my practice, right, and what I was seeing. So East African, because that's the population that was available where I was working. Adolescence, I think adolescence is a culture in its own, and that it needs to be understood. And it needs to be understood from a cultural perspective as well. US high schools, it's a culture in its own. Right, so we're seeing these cultures that are interacting with each other to then inform specific behavior on an individual. The way that I went about conducting this study is I I used a qualitative method. We often hear about quantitative research, which gives numbers, which is great, but we need to be able to describe what we're seeing, right? So it's narrative and it's descriptive. So that's what I did. And I also wanted to look at the phenomenon of acculturation from these teens' experiences, not mine, right? So, I mean, research in cultural psychology takes time because we need to be able to understand, are we talking about the same thing when we say acculturation, right? So that's the first step. And then second, I conducted interviews. Even with the interview, they needed to be open enough so that the students or the participants were able to actually tell me what they think, right? That I'm not prescribing an idea to them, but what we wanted to hear is what they thought about the process. Now, this is not a popular method in psychology, qualitative research. It's growing now, and when I conduct research, I'm usually just doing qualitative, right? Because I want to be able to explain what is it that we're actually seeing with these numbers. So the results were interesting. I think it was interesting because I went through my own acculturation experience and they went through their own. So sitting there and listening to them talk about it, I could relate to some of it. What we did find was that acculturation isn't one-dimensional, right? I'm not just sitting and acculturating. What's actually happening is that there's so many things. It's multi-dimensional, right? And one of the questions I asked was, how did you learn about American culture? And a lot of the participants discussed how they learned about American culture through music. So this is prior to them actually moving to the US. It was music in the malls that they used to play. It was music videos on YouTube. And they also talked about fashion, right? The way that people would dress in music videos. So already there was an interaction with culture there, right? So they had this sort of understanding of what to expect. What also came out of these interviews was that there were misunderstandings in assessing performance, right? I don't know about here, but sometimes the US education system doesn't do a good job of really assessing where people are at, right? There's so many variables to take into consideration. Quite a bit of the participants discussed this idea that they were expected to either do an exam or do a test, but some of them didn't. English wasn't their first language, right? And we know in cultural psychology that we think in our language, in a specific language. So if you're bilingual, you might notice that if I speak English, I think in English. I might behave in that way. But if I also speak Shona, which is a Zimbabwean language, I think that way, and I also behave in that way, right? So what they were noticing is that when they were being assessed, they actually said, I know what I'm being asked, but it's difficult to actually express it, right? So you may question whether these assessments that were being done in these schools were accurate. And this is where cultural psychology comes in, is that if I see an assessment, I want to ask those questions, right? Is it really getting information that's accurate, right? Are we asking questions in a way that's actually gonna pull out information, right? Another point was that belonging influenced acculturation. It's interesting when we look at adolescence and we look at theories in the Western part of the world in terms of adolescence, where adolescence is sort of viewed as you're trying to find your identity away from. In this sense, the participants who come from an African background, they were trying to find their identity within, right? So with students, with their teachers, with coaches, that's what they were wanting. That was a priority for them. And it was also interesting is that one of the questions asked about the experiences that these students had in a classroom, whether they played sports. And there were some experiences where they were getting bullied because of the color of their skin, right, or their accent, or their clothing. But what was also interesting was that they really wanted to connect with those same people, right? Which showed that it was belonging was something that was a priority for them. So regardless of how they were being treated, they still wanted to engage and connect with those same people. As we know, language is the biggest barrier. I am for that if you are going to accept students from different cultural backgrounds, it's helpful to actually support them in that, right? A lot of what was happening in the schools was that maybe the participants, the teens, spoke English, but then the parents did not. So the parents couldn't really support their children in a school setting because they didn't really understand paperwork. They didn't understand what was happening. So there was a huge gap with that. So what this showed was that I'm sure you've heard of what's called a third space, right? And I kind of mentioned it at the beginning, is that if I am exposed to several different cultures, right, what I might then create is a third space, third culture, right? Where I have culture, my host culture, my heritage culture, and other cultures that I'm interacting with that I then create my own. Right? I create my own to actually navigate the different spaces. So I create my own when I go home to Zimbabwe. I create my own when I go to the United States. And I create my own when I'm here in Montreal. Right? I'm negotiating, I'm co-creating this space in order to actually be successful in the different spaces that I'm in. Now, at a adolescent age, this might be challenging, right? And one of the responses that I got from some of the participants was support in doing that. At home, they have one culture. At school, they have another culture, right? So they're caught in between this despair and hope. I'm hopeful that I can integrate, but there's despair because I'm not seeing myself in all these settings. I'm seeing parts of myself, which is interesting. And then also the idea of the psychological phenomenon of acculturation is that we need more research when it comes to studying African populations, Black population, because it's different, right? Different generations experience acculturation differently. You might have grandparents who refuse, right, to integrate into Canadian culture, right? They keep their language, they keep their practices, but then their children actually go into schools that require them to integrate, right? So we start to see different layers to this phenomenon. So I'm gonna go back. How do I go back? So this is a point where we're going to discuss again. The question which I had at the beginning is that, is culture intertwined or separate from the mind, right? Is culture intertwined or separate from the mind? So we kind of talked about what psychology is. We talked about what culture is. So if you can have a 5-minute conversation with each other, share your thoughts, bring in your experience, because it's important, because you have lived experiences. And I think that is informative to this question. So I'll give 5 minutes to discuss between you all. Is culture intertwined or separate from the mind?
Yeah. Because if you have several cultures within yourself, I think your brain probably finds a way of navigating all of them in way to respond to situations in your life. I'm thinking, as an example, languages. My daughter keeps popping up of 3 different languages, so you find ways through what each one of them give you. And now I'm thinking the other way around, how your mind as well creates culture as well. How I'm trying to think through, how does that work? What is the other side of the coin? Don't know yet. What do you think of? How is it a co-creation? Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Okay. Hopefully you continue to have those conversations. It's helpful to hear what somebody else is thinking, and how they come to that sort of conclusion. The way that I answer that question is just yes, right? Culture can be separate and can be intertwined with the mind, right? And it's so complicated in terms of in the world of research where you need a direct answer. Is it or is it not? But when it comes to culture, it's not as easy as yes and no, right? So what I'm working on, I mean, I teach here most of the time, so that's where most of my time is spent, is teaching in the psychology department. But what I do is I bring in a cultural lens. I think it's helpful to bring in content, whether you're talking about history, you're talking about personality, that you bring in content from other parts of the world, because it only helps. There's research that talks about how diverse perspectives actually help with learning, right? So that's what I try to do. Outside of Concordia, I also work on encouraging students, Black students, to get into the field of psychology, right? So I am an advocate for that. I want Black students to join the field of psychology, because when it comes to research, you know what to research, right? You know what the differences are, right? So I really encourage that you add to this weird psychological database, that you bring in perspectives from outside the Western world. And a project that I'm starting is to create a textbook in cultural psychology that only has Black research in psychology. It's a huge undertaking. We're looking for funding for that, but that's something that we're going to be working on. Just because, as you were mentioning too in your talk, is that there isn't much, right? I have a lot of students, Black students, who come and say, I want to do psychology, but I don't see myself in that field because we focus on Western perspectives. So that's what I am looking forward to do. I hope this talk kind of triggered something in your mind, that you also wanting to do whatever field that you're in, that you are thinking about your topic, your field, your major, within the context of your own culture. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Shidomo. We'll start the Q&A part of our conversation today. I'll start by asking some questions, and then we'll open to everyone who's here, and I think we can open as well for anyone who's on Zoom. Yes, all right. I made so many notes. All right, I think my first question in hearing both of you is on how, I think both in terms of, and there are such different fields of study and work, but I thought it was very interesting to hear of what you called rebellious methodologies and method making, in terms of thinking both of how we can engage with art history differently, and what methods or tools or ways of working through this field do we need to create in order to engage with Black art and Black art history, but also in psychology, what different ways were necessary for you to do your research and to bring in the aspect of culture and acculturation so that it would make sense and it would speak with the experiences of Black people that you were studying and engaging with. So I'd start with that point of method making and thinking otherwise and creating ways of doing differently.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I really didn't have a choice in order to do the work that I wanted to do. I needed to develop the tools to do it in the way that felt meaningful and productive for the kinds of histories and stories that I want to play a role in recuperating and recording. The fact is that art history, as it was, is in many ways ill-equipped to do the kind of work that I'm interested in doing. And so, you know, a big part of the first period of my career has been just fashioning the tools that I need to actually get to do the work that I want to be doing anyway. I feel like much of the time that I've spent so far has simply been method making sure that I have a toolkit that allows me to then finally, someday perhaps, talk about Black artists in a way that feels real and true. And I feel like I'm getting there, you know, slowly, the writing that I'm doing is becoming more about art and less about how do I even talk about this art. And so to me, it was un mal nécessaire. Like I had no other choice but to find rebellious ways to be an art historian.
For me, it was simple. Reading research, I would get annoyed by this, you know, limited way of thinking about studying people. And the reason why is because I didn't see narratives or descriptions of what was being reported. So I made it a point because culture actually provides meaning to behavior, right? So if you just see a bunch of numbers, I need to know what those numbers mean. I need to know who was studied. I need to know what processes were taking place, what biases were in place in order for me to actually understand the data that I'm looking at, right? The conclusions that we come up with, right? They mean something. They're not evidence-based if they don't include all populations. So that's why I push quite a bit on qualitative research. Mixed methods is great, where you're using both qualitative, quantitative. But we focused, in psychology, we focus quite a bit on quantitative research because we want to keep it scientific. And qualitative research sometimes it takes time, right? And it also takes actually knowing about a culture to be able to do that, right? So for me, it was just like I was annoyed by what I was reading. And that's what led me to doing this.
Okay. And I think also perhaps still within the same realm of the previous question, I think it's very, very interesting how the parameters, the paradigm of visibility and invisibility, of what can be seen and what was previously discussed in theory, and because I think it goes towards this absence of theory and theorists and case studies. I thought it was very interesting how you discussed Black studies as a way not only of recuperating visual arts that were lost or erased or non-considered or destroyed, but also how the act of critical readings are necessary to make it exist. And I think that works as well in terms of the psychology field, or even, so we have both invisibility, but also a visibility that is read negatively. So how do we engage with this paradigm, and how do we subvert it? I think the subversion is probably a key word, goes along with rebellious. And I thought very interesting to think about your own concept of total inversion, of putting something upside down or read backwards as an act that is necessary for us to engage with our respective studies and fields of studies. I don't know if you want to comment on that. It's not necessarily a question. I don't know. Anyone has any questions before I continue?
If anyone here has any questions, please just raise your hand. I'll bring this microphone over to you. And for those who are joining us online, please feel free to either raise your virtual hand or pop your question in the chat and we'll read it out. But we have a question here in the space.
Hello, thank you for your talks. I guess my question is more psychology related, and I'm just wondering, what were the readings, the authors, the teachings that helped you decolonize psychology?
They weren't in psychology, actually. They weren't in psychology, and I think that's why I am trying to do this project of bringing in just a centering of research and theories that are psychology-based, but they're not necessarily in a psychological database. But there are people that are doing good work. And if we think about, for instance, development, there are theories, developmental theories that are out there that center African experience. That when I read, I was like, this makes sense to me that what we believe to be adolescence, right, is the opposite, right, of what we believe here than back home, right? We want to find identity with people, right? I'm not moving away from people, which is what the theories say here. So they're not in psychology. It's a lot of digging, but I think there is a move to bring some of that into the field of psychology, because you do have to look outside different fields to find it.
Please share Zotero after if you can.
Okay.
No, I just want to piggyback on that a little bit and just, I'm curious as well. Do you get pushback? It's a real question, of course, because, for those of us here who are teaching, we all know that, it's not necessarily a smooth ride all the time. I think particularly, I'm not in the sciences at all, but I think particularly in a quote unquote more scientific context, but I think art history is, it has its own scientific ambitions. It really lends itself to certain expectations, and as a result then pushback. And so I'd be interested from both of you in a way, just to know, how that manifests and etc.
In terms of pushback, I would say it's been an interesting decade. When I first arrived in Montreal to do my graduate studies, people were saying some out-of-pocket stuff to me when I was asking questions about Blackness in the museum, Blackness in art. Like, essentially the response was that those questions were fundamentally irrelevant. And also I got questions that questioned the existence of Black life in Canada, period, right? At one point I was presenting a paper in one of my MA courses, literally chronicling the history of Black people in Canada, and then asking, landing on the question, if this long-standing history exists, how come there's so few traces of Black makers in Canadian museums? And one of the questions after my paper was, okay, but have Black people even done anything worth documenting? And I said, did you listen to the last 20 minutes or? Anyway, so that's the beginning of the decade. And then roughly halfway through the decade, we hit the pandemic. And all of a sudden, everybody's got Black squares everywhere. Everyone is BLM. Everyone has always believed blah, 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 right? And now my work is relevant. And so we'll see what the next part of this looks like. But if what Dr. Fatona's work discusses is real, and I believe it's true. There's evidence, like the archival traces corroborate what she observed in the 90s. And our lived experience also corroborate what she's saying, that, with every peak of suddenly Black Lives Matter and everything is representation and blah, 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 there's a necessary valley. And so the question now for us in the arts and culture is, how do we ride these waves in a sustainable manner while continuing to do the work that we need to do? Don't have an answer, I'm working on it, but that's I would say that's how the pushback emerges for me.
Yes, there is quite a bit of pushback in psychology. And I think it comes from general psychology, where we talk about universals. That's how we have theories, that's how we do research. Now, when you add the layer of culture, right, it questions those universals, right? We do have universals, but we're also different. And to leave differences, we're missing a whole part of human experience. And their pushback is then that it questions the research that's been done before, the theories that we understand. I talk a lot about CBT in terms of like practice, because that's what people tend to use. I talk about it from the fact that in my practice, CBT doesn't work, right, with some clients, right? And I think we need to talk about that. Does that mean CBT isn't effective? No, but I think that bringing in new perspectives, I guess people then question the science, right, behind that. So there is quite a bit of, and it's very few people that will, I'm looking for people in the field of psychology, Black people, who are actually centering the experiences of Black people, because you do have Black people that do research in psychology, but it's still centered on the Western perspectives, right? It's still the way that we do research is still centered on Western perspectives. So, and some of that has to do with funding too, what's being funded and what isn't. So there is quite a bit of pushback, but it allows us to also be creative in ways that we conduct research and still getting to what we need to get to.
Thank you. My name is Tibil, PhD student, Concordia. It's not really a question I want to ask, but it's something I want us to take out here and really look into it, especially when it comes to identity, Black. When you read Ben Martin, From Negro to Black to African American, he argues that this identity we accept to ourselves to be called Black, quote unquote, is more or less a language politics, because when we say Negro, it still refers to the same thing. Why do we still, today in the 21st century, still accepting that same coloring identification? And when you look at it deeply, our skin colors are not Black. But why do we have to reject Negro and accept Black? This is a language politics that was being used by our colonizers, and it still has a root on us. Now, we also have other scholars who are debating, especially from the Africa continent, who refuse to be accepted as Blacks, because the Black color that we use to racially describe ourselves, we have Blacks in the Indians, we have Blacks among us in the Pacific Asia. They don't accept themselves as African descendants. But because some of us were being moved from the African continent into different geographical locations, we refuse to accept the connotation that we are African descendants. But most people refer to us as Blacks, and we accept it. I'm bringing this up because last year I was in a symposium in McGill, and this same thing came up, Black. Then In short, it was about Black emancipatory, how Black scholars use data, the method to fight racial, abuse in Montreal. Then I asked this question. I think before the civil rights in the US, America, we had every Pan-Africanist coming together to fight for one cause as Africans, irrespective of where you are located. But today, I'm observed that we have people who you asked, where you're from, he'll tell you, I'm Black. Which part of the continent? Okay, I'm a Caribbean. I'm an US. I'm Black from Canada. And I think we are still separated by this geography, but we still accept the coloring, identification, which is Black. My question, not really a question, I just wanted to still re-examine that in academic. The notion of Black, that which I think we are not Blacks, but we came from somewhere. And I think something took us from where we came from to different geographical locations. So it's good we visit our root and really identify ourselves properly where we are coming from. And I think with that, we can able to stand on one platform to fight for a common cause. Thank you.
I think that's a great point. And I think also thinking about what the purpose of, using that term Black to group people is really, especially in academia, right? And I talked about how when it comes to research, if I did my research, which was on East African, right? It doesn't speak to the Black population. I can't generalize that. And the goal of research, at least in psychology, is to generalize. So you're also working against systems that want that in place, right? So I can generalize information. So you might find that if you're doing a study specifically on East African, that your grant might not go through it, but if you say Black people, it might, because it's broad, right? So there's that aspect, and I think that on an individual level as well, identity is important. I know that from my experience, right? I know I'm from Zimbabwe because I was there, I grew up there, right? I go to the US where it's Black American or African American. That's what they know, right? And there's this sort of different of experiences that are there, because I know where home is, I've been home, versus somebody, this is their home, right? They've heard that this is where you're from, but never been. So I think part of it is that there is a difference in experiences, and sometimes we don't tend to understand each other from that perspective. But you're absolutely right, is that if we come to an agreement, which I think it's happening in academia too, and just socially, that people are now, with technology, right, that you're able to engage with different cultures and see, or even find where you're from, or people going back, right, and being accepted on the continent, right? And I think that is very important, especially in psychology, because we focus on individuals, and we're working with individuals. That's why I say that it's important to be able to understand culture, right? Because then that nuance isn't captured when we report studies. So thank you for that point.
I agree. I mean, I would say that sometimes terminology is a useful tool to be able to begin to articulate something that would otherwise be difficult to grasp or to frame. And so being able to use common language, and it's funny because I feel like I'm back in my seminar from earlier today, because we talked about these topics, and a lot of things are actually coming back in our conversation, particularly what you were saying about data being numbers and it needing to be qualified and contextualized in meaningful ways. I do think that it's important to, for me anyway, in my work, to think in a both and mindset, right? We are both from Africa in various ways, through myriad pathways, right? And also Black in the sort of diasporic poetics of relation sense of the term and the Black Atlantic sense of the term. So I think that there's usefulness in thinking from a stance of multiplicity. Two things can be true at once. That's how I think through the points that you're bringing to the table. So thank you for that.
Does anyone else have a question? None that I'm seeing in the space. Let me just double check online.
No? Okay. Yeah, one point that I would go back to was in terms of what tools and what methods are being created in order to work in both fields. I think it's very interesting in your paper about community canvassing and oral histories and memory work as ways of understanding different types of documents that there can be in order to work through art history. And I'm curious also in how, I think you mentioned as well, Dr. Shiramo, but what methods of research of engaging with the adolescents as in your research there were in ways of creating different methodologies.
I think that I can't take credit for it. I had a supervisor, the only Black supervisor in my program who helped me with that. And I think that I was also informed by my own experience, right? So I'm also engaging with research and even the term acculturation. I had my own understanding of it. I actually was like, I don't know what that is, right? And what I wanted to do, my goal was really to capture the essence of what was being said, right? I wanted to be sure that that's what I was doing. It took time, and just even understanding what kinds of interview questions. There's a way to ask questions, I think, that allows for, that are not leading, right? It's just open, right? So there were times when I asked a question and the team was just talking. It didn't have anything to do with the topic, but in that, it was interesting to watch, to see themes that were kind of coming out of that. And I think we miss a lot when we don't do that, right? Where we're even working with teens. I feel like they can tell you what's actually occurring versus what we know in terms of theory, right? So once you do that, then you go back to the theory of acculturation, where John Berry talks about the 4 strategies we use, right? And you can say, are those actually legit in terms of working with this particular population? And some were and some weren't, right? So that's informative, but I think that it takes time. And I think it also takes knowledge of the culture, right? Which is why, again, I go back to this idea of bringing in, Black students in the studies, right? Because you would think about it, like actually acculturation doesn't mean the same thing, or I need to work with a consultant within that culture to help me understand, like, are we talking about the same thing? We talk about equivalency in cultural psychology, which really talks about how the material that you use, the method that you use, data collection, is it equivalent? Are we really talking about the same thing? Because if it's not, then we're not capturing accurate data.
Thank you.
Well, in terms of tools and methods being created to be able to work in the field of art history, I think that my strategy has always been to seek out Black women and to learn from Black feminists across different fields. So there are, especially in the US, it's very interesting, the US versus Canada Black life conundrum, because in the US we have quite a well-established African-American art history, whereas in Canada that's very much not the case. So I've been looking a lot to Black feminist art historians in the United States. I've also been just looking at Black feminist scholarship more broadly to start to wrap my head around what it means to enact Black feminism, right? There's the principles and the concepts and the theories of Black feminisms, and I'm really kind of in my work trying to move into the enacting in my research. What does it look like to do feminist art history, Black feminist art history specifically? And so that's how I've been able to sort of cobble together an approach, is by looking at Black feminist scholars who are interested in Black visualities.
Thank you.
Just to hop on what you just said, because I think I'm interested in just hearing a little bit more about the gender component in both your situations, because I'm sure it's present but different, you know. When you, in different ways, you're both interested in stories. You know what I mean? And I'm making an enormous generalization, but of course that's also related to my own experience and cultural background. And the women hold the stories. So I'm just interested in hearing how that might manifest or not, you know, like in what you're doing, both of you.
Thank you for that. Yes. In the Canadian context specifically, one of the things that I've learned and seen is that Black women are very much at the forefront of Black curatorial work, Black art historical work. I wouldn't be able to zoom out and say specifically why that is. I think if I were to make an educated guess, I would trace it to the history of how labor is divided in Black community. If we look at the context of Montreal specifically, during the early 1900s with the Canadian Railway, a lot of Black men were not here. So and to no fault of their own, of course, and Black women were the art educators, and that continues to be the case. That isn't to say that there aren't Black men doing the work. David Woods has been, that man is busy. And he's been doing so much work for many decades, and he has done a tremendous amount of research and recuperation for Black art in the Maritimes specifically. And so throw all the flowers at David. His practice is fundamental to being able to even begin to think about a Black Canadian art canon, right? It also seems, from what I've seen, that David is very lonely in the field in terms of gender, right? There are very few other Black men that I've noticed doing this kind of work. Again, I don't know that I can say why, but these are just the things that I've noticed.
For me, it's the opposite. I think African men, the research that I've seen, the literature is pioneered by African men. And actually I haven't thought about that, but that's what I see. And I think maybe that's why when I speak of this topic, there's so much resistance. In the way that even in settings like this, when I talk about, I want to focus my research on the African voice. I get questions about, isn't that like discriminating because of that? And I'm like, well, I mean, psychology kind of is doing that, right? But just because I say that, that's what I want to focus on. And I wonder if I were a Black African man, if that's the same response that I would get. But the research that I see, which is not even in psychology, is African men who pioneering that work. So,
is that? I mean, you can't answer it, so you know, I mean, I'm just kind of voicing the question and leaving it in the space a little bit. But the depending on again the cultural context, and cultural context, I'm also including former colonial context, etc. All those things that dictate what gets done where, how, and by whom. You know, like, yeah, if it's the men that's writing, who are writing, what are the women doing? You know, of course, it's not that they're not doing anything, but it's interesting to just see where you know, when we throw it all up in the air, where do the cards land, in a way?
Hi. My question is very complicated in my mind yet, but I feel like I want to put it out. It's just because we've been talking about the Western way of researching and decolonizing the studies and the research. I think it might be just an issue of terminology. I think we tend, because historically it's almost impossible to differentiate like the Western society to whiteness. And I think it's pretty clear to us on how do research going around the whiteness and like not touching the ways that white people have been researching. But I wonder for us, and I feel like most of this, probably this room here are people from the Western society. We all, maybe for exception for you, that you were born in, I mean, you were born in the US, but you lived in Zimbabwe. So I wonder how we can produce or we can research in a non-Western way, whereas like whereas the people, and again, I'm just gonna repeat, I understand the way of like not reproducing whiteness, but not reproducing Western. I'm just thinking like, is this a Black utopia, what we're saying here? Is this even possible? Is this even attainable to do something that is not Western, us being Western people?
That's a very interesting question. And I don't have a fully formed answer for you, of course. But I'm wondering why we would need to position ourselves in opposition to like West versus non-Western, because there, as I think you're gesturing towards, there's no way that I could ever produce knowledge that is not fundamentally rooted in my Canadianness, right? That is an empirical fact. And so so I think that for me, that question is a non-starter in the sense that I know that I will never not be Canadian in the sense of, in the cultural sense, in the sense of that's just, I've been educated here, I went to school here my entire life, and so my worldview is fundamentally entwined with being here and having lived here. And I would hope that people who are producing knowledge from certain places would not purport to be producing knowledge that emerges from a different place. Like, I would never present my work as being Caribbean studies, for example, even though I'm Haitian and that is my culture. My work does not emerge from the Caribbean because that's not a place that I have academic roots in, or am I making any sense? Okay. So that's how I would respond to that for now.
Yes, that's a great question. And I believe anything's possible. But I think that, that's why I personally appreciate cultural psychology, because the stance is that both are valuable. They're actually not in opposition. Now, society actually presents them in opposition, right? And I tend to think, what is the goal or the purpose of the study, right? If the purpose is to push a theory versus actually understanding human experience, that's different, right? I think it's useful to ask that question as you're also engaging in research, right? We see so much research out there, but to be able to read something and ask a question like that is, where is this coming from? Who's saying it? I think that's powerful enough, right? To then now, if you want to go and do a study, those are things that you think about and consider. But I am for that, I think you can. And I think maybe because of my cultural background, there are things that are being done outside of the Western world that we're not aware of, right? There are African scholars that are doing wonderful work, but we just don't get to hear about it. They're not in the databases that we're ascribed to at universities. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, that there is work that's being done, and that it doesn't not center whiteness or Western world. I mean, we call psychological database weird. There's whiteness in that. So we do studies on white people, educated people, right? Rich people. So there is understanding that the database in psychology is centered around that. So, but then if we don't have people, researchers like you all, who conduct research on, Black African population, then it will always be weird population, right? And there's, I think that it's a great question, and that's something that we should constantly ask ourselves, because anything is possible.
I mean, it's not a response, it's just an observation. I think that, this idea that like Joanna says, I mean, I'm born and raised in Jamaica, lived in Europe for years, now live here. I mean, there's no way I'm not Western. However, Western is not a monolith either. So inside, for me, what is important, two things. One is to acknowledge that inside of that Westernness, there is invisibility, hypervisibility, how are we addressing those things? And then the other piece to that is, I'm drawn to somebody I am incredibly inspired by, Glissant, who, talks about the poetics of the earth. The land we are on that generates that thought matters. So the thought generated by, if I even just use myself as an example, the thought generated by me in the Caribbean or me in Brussels or me here, it's not the same. And so how do I allow that to live with value so that it's actually affecting the, just our capacity to be critical together, kind of thing. Okay, Ganesh.
As a commentary also to your question, it brought me to Fred Moten and also Glissant, that we are in it and there's no way to be outside of it. So I think that coming back together to what we were discussing, how do we subvert it or disrupt or question, are the main ways of engaging with the questions and the theories and the invisibilities and all of it. So I think we arrived at the end of our session today. Thank you all for being here and for the questions and discussions. Thank you very much. This was beautiful, and we also have another session on March 13, the fourth session of the speaker series with Tesfa Peterson and Dr. Nicola Smith here at First Space and on Zoom. So thank you again, and now we have food and more conversations. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again to everyone who joined us for this conversation, both in the space and online. Thank you for your questions and for these engaging presentations. We're going to go ahead, close up the Zoom and the live stream now, but just a quick reminder that this is already available on our YouTube channel if you wish to revisit or share it. And again, as a reminder, the next session will be here at Fourth Space, March 13th. So we'll see you there. Have a great one, everyone.